G'day folks, welcome to the next step in setting up for this campaign of Barbarossa Army Group Centre 1941, published by GMT. This is the second edition. Setting up these scenario cards is an important part of getting ready. You lay out all these units on the setup cards, and then the units are placed in their setup locations. Sometimes they'll have a do not move marker on them, which indicates that they don't move on game turns 1 or 2. But looking over these units gives you a sense of the strengths and weaknesses of the various forces. I've got the Germans over to my left, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I just wanted to spend some time talking about the respective strengths and weaknesses of the Russians and the Germans. So here we have the Russian setup. This is for mainly map C, and then map I, map WA, and map H. So a lot of Russian units set up on the map along the frontier at the start, and these are their reinforcements. It's a very long reinforcement schedule for the Russians, which runs way down off camera down here. The setup chart above here shows the special reinforcement pull groups, and somebody asked some questions about these, so I'll talk about those in just a moment as well. Looking over the Russians, there are a lot of units, but there are a lot of relatively weak infantry divisions. So there's a 444, here's a regiment, 1, 2, 4. They have a lot, but they're all relatively weak. The Russians really, in their defense, rely on their operational headquarters, and they rely on their motorized, mechanized, red highlighted movement value units, basically. These units are important because they are the units that will be principally responding to Axis attacks. During an attack, there is, as part of the turn sequence, a Soviet reaction phase, and eligible motorized units conduct reaction movement moving at 1/2 of their movement allowance. This is where careful placement of these units behind likely Axis targets is important. An ideal Russian front line will have some infantry occupying key locations, defendable hexes behind a fortified line, for example, with headquarters and these motorized units available kind of in a reserve behind the line, such that they can, with half their movement allowance, respond to the declared attacks by the Axis. It's often the case during setup, I'll point this out in a subsequent video, that is kind of set up for you, but as the Russians need to retreat, as the Axis break through and they try to reform their line, it's important to keep that system going. So yeah, a lot of relatively weak Russian regiments and divisions with those mechanized units with a good defense value and the ability to counterattack as well. The Russians will start with what are called mandated defenses, and when the Germans capture victory point locations, any unsatisfied mandatory attacks are converted into victory points. So it may be prudent for the Russians to try to launch these counterattacks when they can. There are certain requirements on that. There's a certain odds ratio that they're required and the strength required to satisfy that mandatory attack, but it mitigates the possibility of the Axis powers gaining victory points for unsatisfied mandatory attacks early in the game. These mandatory attacks can pop up throughout the course of the replacements phase. If you roll, the Soviets roll an M event, I'll show you this very briefly. So if they roll an M event, it adds 1 or 2 mandated attacks to basically their records to track, which is frustrating for the Russians. You may also see all these green units. These are NKVD units, and they're an interesting unit that they automatically provide a no retreat order in eligible terrain to the stack they're stacked with. They're basically forcing all the Russian infantry to defend and not retreat and get into the fight. They will also take the last step loss in a battle. So basically they'll send the infantry forward to defend, and they'll be the last one standing once everyone else has been thrown into the slaughter. Artillery plays an important role for the Russians as well. There's kind of a scattering of Russian artillery. Russian artillery and armor losses are critical. That's something for them to keep an eye on. What else? Okay, anti-air. So you'll notice scattered throughout some anti-air units. Let me try to find one. Here we go. Okay, so there's this difference in the anti-air responses by the two sides. Most German combat units can, when the Russians send their air over, most German combat units can fire anti-air. For the Russians, they have to be division-sized infantry or above in the area. Anti-air units provide an additional beneficial modifier. I'm trying to find the chart to those anti-air attempts. So let me show you this is the kind of air initiative and air combat tables. Here's the AA fire table, and here are the modifiers. So if you have a firing AA type unit, they had a +1 modifier. Soviet HQ firing, another +1 modifier. Firing at vulnerable German aircraft, another +1 modifier. That's when the Soviets are firing. So having those AA units in the vicinity is helpful, but not necessarily required. Here are the restrictions. So no AA fire is allowed if the mission hex and all 6 surrounding hexes contains only cavalry units, or the critical one here, only Soviet non-AA, so infantry or non-HQ units of less than division size. Okay, so you need to have those Soviet combat units of division size or greater to engage in AA fire. You basically roll the die, apply the modifiers, and, well, if you're the one rolling, you want to roll high to ideally destroy, damage, or abort the air mission. So yeah, AA plays a role, but it's not as critical as you might think. It's just a subtle little modifier. Now, Axis AA units can sort of double as bunker busting units, and that's when they're attacking certain terrain types. They can double their attack strength when on the offensive, so that the Germans are basically bringing in their AA guns to help with their attacks. So I mentioned it's important to have those headquarters close to the front lines as well. Only the Soviets have these headquarters. They have a lot of them, but of course it's a big map. Now these have a range of 4 hexes kind of around them, and they're used for sort of a range of purposes. Each of these headquarters will have a command rating on the left-hand side, and that's used for a couple of different things. You'll often use it to activate non-motorized units during the motorized movement phase. It gives you that kind of extra little unit. They can also, headquarters can activate guards units for free. That's in addition to their regular command points. I mentioned the NKVD units place no retreat orders. You can use the headquarters to remove those no retreat orders. You can, what else? Oh, of course you can place orders. So the headquarters are used to place orders on nearby combats, and they enable operation headquarters enable you to use that Soviet artillery within range. But of course, having them operational is important. If there are non-operational headquarters, they actually impose penalties. So it's actually a really big disadvantage for the Soviets to have non-operational. On the reverse side, they have what says, I'm sure there was a few around, but here we go, non-operational. When you have a non-operational headquarters in range, it applies all these penalties. It restricts construction within its range. You can't conduct close air support within their range, and it limits artillery supply, in addition to sort of a range of other things. So basically, bad to have non-operational Soviet headquarters. Okay, let me shift over to show you the Germans. So they're over here, and yeah, well they have. I'll point out first. They have. They will quickly gain air superiority. Around turn 6, they get all these air markers. There are special rules to kind of guide the opening air sorties. Key for the Germans is, if you can see, their coloured Panzer and motorised divisions. These provide the critical combined arms bonuses and Panzer division integrity bonuses. Okay, these can be cumulative as well. So if you have 3 different Panzer divisions qualifying, it's a -3 dice roll modifier, and they'll often bring combined arms as well, terrain weather permitting. As I mentioned in the last video, it is critical to keep these formations together. And if you look over them, as I said, 2 stacking points, 2 stacking points, 2 stacking points, 2 stacking points. You can quite easily stack these entire Panzer divisions within a single hex. Move them around together. They typically have at least 7 movement points. The reconnaissance units have 9. And move and attack as a quite large force. You notice their attack values. They've got 9 plus 8, 17. That's often enough to pick off these relatively weak Soviet units just by themselves. You can have a single Panzer division running around as a stack, overrunning isolated Soviet defenders with odds of 17-1, 8-1. Quite handy for those overrun die rolls. What else is interesting about the Germans? They have a lot of assault guns. They're bunker busting as well. I mentioned their anti-aircraft guns can be used for this bunker busting bonus too. They have more artillery, and it's more powerful. At least I think it's more. At a glance, they seem to have a lot more. They're certainly used a lot more frequently. They have their super heavy artillery as well. And this is, here's the super heavy artillery table. This is specifically used for attempting to destroy citadels and fortified lines, or suppressing, in effect, cancelling the modifiers for other terrain. So you're bringing this, it's very slow, I'll point out, you're bringing this super heavy artillery in where you anticipate kind of a big, tough, in effect, siege situation to attempt to break down those Russian fortified positions as quickly as possible. For the Germans as well, I'm pointing out the rail networks and how critical the rail and road networks are. Management of their MSUs is critical. For the Russians often seem to have ample supplies. They're not attacking as frequently as well. The Germans are on the offensive. Offensives require supply. Careful management of these is important. You'll notice the dumps increase from 1 mobile supply unit to a 2 dump to a 3 dump to a 4 dump. Usually you're getting up to a 4 dump in critical locations where you'll be having multiple attacks sort of fanning out from a city, or a sort of a series of attacks. You'll draw a line of communication to these dumps. You spend the supply unit, so if it's a 3 it goes down to a 2, it's a 4 it goes down to a 3 basically. And yeah, you fuel your attack, get those modifiers, and avoid the punitive modifiers. Now we'll point out, you don't always have to fuel your attacks. You don't always have to provide supplies for your attacks. Yes, there are punitive modifiers and you lose those beneficial modifiers, but if you're in a situation where you've got 9 or 10-1 odds and you don't necessarily need a big attack, I'll show you the CRT. At 9-1, if you roll, I'll point out the attacker wants low results, so a 0 on 9-1 or a 1 on 1-1 will eliminate the enemy, but even a high roll at 10, 11 is still causing a step loss or a retreat. So if you don't need much from that combat, it may be a good decision to keep your supplies for a more important battle down the track. So yeah, you can make that decision to supply the combat or not. I pointed out the Germans have a lot of air superiority. I'll talk more about that in a later video. Yeah, so this is their on-map units, and then a lot of, well, not a lot. In fact, it gets harder for the Germans. They begin to withdraw certain formations. They need to punch hard quickly. Okay, let me point out the Soviet special reinforcement pool groups. So the Germans have these as well. I didn't point those out on the right-hand side of that card. This is the Soviet pools. These are probably more important for the Soviets than it is for the German, and these come into play via events on the replacement charts, which I'm trying to find. So in effect, each turn you roll on the replacement charts, which I'm trying to find. Here we go. Okay, and it'll tell you how many strong points you get, how many new strong points you're building, type of replacements you're getting, infantry and other types, vehicle or air or armoured replacement points. And then these special events. So I mentioned the mandatory attacks, but this is also where you get the R result, which is to either release garrisons. So garrisons are usually locked into locations, they can't move, you can release them, or you can spend these R results to draw a special reinforcement pool group. What this means is you look across the pool group, you consult the turn schedule, so you make sure it's eligible. So these are only available from game turns 21 to 44, these are 36 to 49. It's basically organised by turns. So on turn 6, you'll be eligible to unlock either of these two groups. It often involves sacrificing victory points. So if the Soviets want to release this group of artillery and rocket artillery, they have to sacrifice 2 victory points. But then they take this group with their R result and place them on the map in their designated areas or map locations. And this is an interesting decision. You're sacrificing victory points to bring more forces in. And generally, it's an important part of the Soviet strategy to manage these and select their units carefully to bring the right units on. I mean, this is a great group of two armoured divisions and a cavalry regiment coming on at 0 VPs from game turns 6 to 20. So as soon as the Soviets can roll an R result from game turn 6 onwards, they want to bring that reinforcement group out. Here's a big group of infantry, but that costs 4 victory points. 2 victory points for this group, that's pretty good as well. Headquarters 30. This is a non-operational headquarters coming in, and they're also placed in garrison. So yeah, depending on the situation, you can make, as a Russian, some interesting decisions about what group you're bringing on, the cost of bringing that group on, where they're placed, and what you need. If you've lost a lot of armoured units, certainly, regardless, bring on group 2, but there are other, here we go, group 17 from game turn 21, a huge group of small Russian armoured brigades. This is critical as well from game turn 21 onwards. You've got the guards from game turn 36 onwards. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward process. If you roll that R, you can pick a group, pay the cost, bring them on if they're within the eligible game turn range. And again, the Germans have a small group of special reinforcement pools as well that they can quite bring on freely. What else? Okay, so it's worth pointing out, I mentioned German air superiority. I'll also point out the pretty poor values among the Russian air units. So these have close air support values of 0, 0, 1, 1. The Il-2 has a 2, 1. That's their best unit, but it's only one of them on game turn 6. And generally, the German units, just for comparison, have far greater combat values and attack values. I'm trying to find the 87s. Here they are. So yeah, 2 close air support, 2 interdiction rating, and of course the Bf-109 Fs have a 4 air rating, the bottom left corner there, which is really good for gaining air superiority, supporting their air missions. The key takeaway from this is that the Germans will dominate the air, they will dominate air combat. The Russians need to pick and choose when and where they defend and how they defend. They will, if they do this poorly, they'll very quickly find a lot of their air units heading to the destroyed box or the damaged box, which again hurts them long term. So yeah, careful selections in Russian air responses is important in the long term for them. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this kind of these German air sorties are sort of weaved into the invasion turn rules for the first 3 turns in particular. Rocket artillery. So I've pointed out artillery. Rocket artillery can overstack and then it must retreat. So they basically have a range of 1. I'm sure I saw one just a moment ago. They're in here somewhere. They're an interesting unit. Where is the rocket artillery? Oh, where is it? Come on. Guards, here we go. Here's some guards, rocket artillery. You'll see they have a range of 1, but they have got a really good attack value. So you bring these right up into combat, they attack, they join in the attack, they can overstack, and then they instantly retreat away from that combat as part of the combat resolution. Yeah. Look, happy to elaborate if there's anything anyone wants to know in any more detail, but that's it's interesting to look over these and get a sense of Russian weaknesses, Russian strengths, and German strengths and weaknesses. The next step is to put these on the map, and we can begin to evaluate this in even more detail. All right, folks, take care.